going to be good.
Well, if you look in the writings of the new atheists, Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, one of the classical arguments you'll find is, look, the God of the Bible is a dreadful God who's ordering all sorts of murder and mayhem and chaos. How about this passage we came across recently in the liturgy from the book of Exodus, in the story of Israel battling the Amalekites again, and Moses putting his arms up as long as he's praying, the battle goes well. And finally, Yahweh carries the day, and we hear this now. And Joshua mowed down Amalek and all his people with the edge of the sword. And it's followed immediately here in the lectionary by the word of the Lord. So I realize that even devout Christians can find this kind of passage difficult. Now, why? Well, it's because it seems so out of step with the God of the New Testament.
Well, I mean, it's not because it's out of step. I think most people just find it difficult because it's obviously terrible.
Well, I'd say to both the new atheists and to Christians who wrestle with this is not a new problem, as though we've discovered this in the 21st century. This is an old issue in the life of the church. It goes back to some of the earliest days. There were people, think of the Gnostics, and especially of the Marcionites back in the 2nd century, who said, let's solve the problem simply by jettisoning the Old Testament.
They were the smart ones. That would have been a great idea.
One of the great figures now around this time was Origen of Alexandria. I've spoken to him many times before. He's kind of a theological hero of mine. Origen knew this problem and wrestled with it. Here's his first observation. We must read the entire Bible from the standpoint of the last book of the Bible. What does he mean? He means in the 5th chapter of the book of Revelation, we have that great scene. The visionaries up in the heavenly space. And a scroll comes out. So in those days, there weren't books like we have like this, but a scroll. So this great scroll, and it's sealed by 7 seals. The scroll stands for, if you want, the whole of the Bible. It's the whole of God's revelation. The sealing means it's hard to read. It's hard to interpret. Who will unlock it? So we hear that voice. Who will unlock, who will unseal the scroll?
Where is he getting these interpretations? Because especially when it comes to something as acid trip-esque as the book of Revelation, there are 1,000 different ways you can interpret it. I don't know if he's actually submitting that this is the correct interpretation, but if he is, I would certainly like to hear why he thinks so.
Out comes a little lamb. And more to it, a little lamb who's been slain. It says the lamb standing as though slain. In other words, a figure of utter weakness and mildness, meekness, is the one who alone can open the seals. The point now is very clear, but it's very important. The only standpoint from which we should read the whole of the Bible is the standpoint of Christ crucified.
I mean, this is numerology level. Just reading it, taking some random interpretation that's no more or less coherent with the writing than 1,000 other interpretations, and then just sort of declaring that the correct one. I mean, I'm sure Bishop Barron knows that there can be problems that arise from having many different interpretations of something that are all claiming to be the correct one. I would like to know why he thinks this one is correct. I mean, have, linguistic anthropologists analyzed this text and they've determined that, oh yeah, this is what it's talking about? Or is this just sort of like, oh yeah, the early church fathers were reading this and they were trying to think of a way that they could wriggle out of God being a terrible, terrible deity. And so they said, oh yeah, well, this interpretation, that would fix it. So I think that seems like the right one.
Very clear, but it's very important. The only standpoint from which we should read the whole of the Bible is the standpoint of Christ crucified. The Lamb standing as though slain, of course, is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world precisely through his suffering on the cross. Now, here's the point, Origen's point, very important. If, therefore, we read the Bible in such a way that we see God as capricious and cruel, or that encourages us to be violent, we are ipso facto misreading it. I want to say that again, because I think it's a very important point in the 2nd century and today. If you read the Bible in such a way that it leads you to say, hey, violence is a good thing, I should be more violent, or that God is hateful and violent, you have ipso facto misread it.
Well, that solves your whole problem, yeah. All you have to do is say, by definition, if you read the Bible in such a way that it seems like God isn't, what we make him out to be, you're wrong. Why? Oh, because, it's by definition. Because the Bible tells us. He just quoted or referenced a book of the Bible in order to say, oh, don't worry, guys. The Bible tells us that if you read the Bible in such a way that the Bible isn't compelling or consistent, you must be wrong. I hope I don't have to explain the problem with that.
Okay. Once that moves in place, it's a very important one. We still have the problem in some ways. Well, how do you read these famously difficult passages where God does seem to be pretty violent and cruel? Well, Origen said, read these passages in a metaphorical, allegorical, and symbolic way as about the spiritual struggle.
Okay, is Origen saying read it like that because, we don't want God to seem like a bad guy? Or is he actually giving us any compelling reason to believe that those verses are meant to be metaphorical? What is the criteria by which he is judging verses in the Bible to be either metaphorical or literal? Is he applying this universally, or is he starting with the idea that the Bible must be right and God is a great guy, and then taking that conclusion and going in and deciding which verses are metaphorical based on that? Because if you're just deciding arbitrarily, well, how do you know any of the verses are literal or any of the verses are metaphorical? Maybe the virgin birth was also a metaphor. Maybe dying on the cross maybe the empty tomb was a metaphor. If you just start with your conclusion and you go back and read the Bible in such a way that supports it, number one, you don't need the Bible, and number two, you are not offering a more compelling case than any other Christian in the world who has read the Bible in a different way. All of your interpretations are equally legitimate.
Israel stands for all that's in accord with God's purposes, for love and for forgiveness and compassion. And therefore, the enemies of Israel up and down the centuries, from the Amalekites to the Philistines, to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, are not just about those ancient people. It stands for all the things that stand to thwart God's purposes. How should we fight them?
Wow, that must be really rough. Your civilization, in the Bible, they get the task of representing everything that's displeasing to God. That's unlucky.
With that in mind, go back to one of the most notorious of the difficult passages, and that is God's command to Saul to put the ban on the Amalekites. So the same people, by the way, that Moses was fighting. Put the ban on them. Kill every man, woman, child, animal, right? And Saul doesn't do that. He kills most of them. He defeats them, but then keeps a lot of the livestock for himself, and he keeps King Agag, the king of the Amalekites, for himself. Maybe to hold him for ransom or who knows what, but he didn't kill him. Samuel the prophet comes in, he upbraids Saul, and he takes out his sword, and it says he hacked Agag to pieces. Now again, you say, how in the world is this in the Bible, and how in the world is this describing the true God? Think for a second. What do most of us sinners do with evil? We play around with it. We toy with it. We battle it to some degree, but then we typically keep a little bit for ourselves, right? We don't battle it.
This interpretation, like, I could come up with a dozen interpretations on the spot that are just as valid as this. This is just him reading whatever he wants into the scriptures.
Here's a couple metaphors here. You know, suppose I went to Cardinal George and I said, Your Eminence, I'm so happy being a celibate priest that I'm celibate, 90% of the time. How happy would he be? Or if a husband went to his wife and said, honey, I love you, my marriage, it means so much to me. That's why I'm faithful to you, 75% of the time. I doubt she'd be real thrilled about that. Or if you said, yeah, child sex abuse, that's a real serious problem in this diocese, which is why, we got it about 65%.
Okay, yes, I understand the metaphor he's making. Yes, you shouldn't half-ass something. My problem is the fact that he's reading these scriptures in such a way that he's just concluding, just because it's convenient for his narrative, that all of these tribes represent sin, and these aren't actually historical events. Whereas I assume, I don't know, the Exodus out of Egypt, or the wandering in the desert, or Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac, are those metaphors? If not, why not?
Which is why we got it about 65% under control. No, I mean some forms of evil are so profound, they have to be hacked to pieces. We have to put the ban on them. You're an ancient Israelite, so you're a warlike people, as many of them were. They're fighting all the time against their enemies. And you're writing in a poetic way. You're trying to express the truth of God through a poetic allusion. What are you going to reach for? You're a warlike people. Well, you might reach for this militaristic metaphor.
I like how theologians will always try and argue that the only way to get through to people back in the day was by saturating everything with stories about slaughter and rape and murder and conquering. That, like, this is the language that they'll understand. Despite the fact that God is coming down to people like Paul and just blasting them in the face with, knowledge of his goodness and his beauty. But when it comes to these other verses talking about God doing bad things, that's a metaphor, because God, he's God, but these people, they're kind of tricky, they're not all the lights are on upstairs, and you got to be really you got to dress everything up, in the type of language that they'll think is really cool, the stuff they'll really go for. That's the best way that God could communicate to people back in the day that he was fully opposed to sin.
Yahweh fights for his people. Yahweh fights the enemies of Israel. Well, how's he going to fight them? If you're trying to describe God, right? God who's all-powerful, all-sovereign, what are you going to say? Are you going to say, yeah, and he killed half of Israel's enemies. That's the God we believe in. Yeah, he's great. God killed a third of the Philistines. No. If you're a poet and you're trying to express in this militaristic metaphor what God's power is like, what are you going to say? You're going to say, he wiped out the enemies of Israel. He eliminated, he put the ban on them.
You know what? Here, I have a great example of the metaphorical language that he's talking about. Numbers 31, verses 14 through 18. But Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who were returning from the battle. Have you spared all the women? He asked them. Look, these women caused the sons of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to turn unfaithfully against the Lord at Peor, so that the plague struck the congregation of the Lord. So now, kill all the boys, as well as every woman who has had relations with a man, but spare for yourselves every girl who has never had relations with a man. So these are the types of metaphors that God just had to use to get through to these peoples around ancient Palestine. That God is a powerful God who not only destroys sin, he commands that the daughters of sin be taken and raped and kept as sex slaves, but only if they're virgins. You only keep the good stuff. I mean, it is just so absurd to imagine that this was the best way that God could communicate with the ancient peoples. That all he could do was give us these horrible metaphors about keeping virgins as sex slaves and slaughtering women and children. This was the only way he could get through to people, assuming that this is metaphor, which again is a completely baseless assertion that Bishop Barron has just put forward. And even that can't save this absolute mess.
Again, don't be obsessed with, oh, that's a historical journalistic description of what exactly happened, but rather as a poetic evocation of the power and sovereignty of God, but using precisely a militaristic metaphor. Now, we find that metaphor distasteful today. Okay, so what? I mean, we got a different cultural setting. That was a metaphor that a lot of ancient peoples would have reached for, as the ancient Israelites did. I'll just close with this, because it bugs me in the new atheists, and I see it on the internet, of course, all the time, as people bring this up as though it's some new discovery that Christopher Hitchens figured out. Oh, the Bible's, showing us a cruel God. Sam Harris uncovered the great mystery that the Bible... Come on. Our great people have known about this problem from the beginning, and they've given us very rich interpretive strategies.
I love that phrase that he used there. Very rich interpretive strategies. I would agree 100% that these are strategies devised after you have already concluded that this stuff must all be right in some way, shape, or form, and your only task is coming up with some interpretation or explanation in which it makes sense to you, in which it can still be right. And I agree, of course, that yes, obviously this is a very old problem. People in the church have wrestled with this for thousands of years. And I really wanted to sink in that after 2,000 years, this is the best that they have been able to do. Christianity has swept the Western world. Practically every great philosopher and writer and poet has been Christian for most of the past 2,000 years in Western civilization. They have all been working on stuff like this. How do we interpret, the Bible? How do we make sense of this stuff? And this is the best that they've come up with. Like, oh, well, I don't know, it must be a metaphor. Maybe that's just, the way that ancient peoples wanted to hear it. And it was, the best move for God was come with these horrible, horrible stories to make them, to really drive the point home to people that he really doesn't like sin. This is not a shortcoming of people like Bishop Barron, who are very intelligent and great philosophers, who obviously are some of the smartest people who ever lived. It is a testament to just how bad this book is, just how much of a complete mess it is, and how hopelessly Its morals and its stories and its implications clash with a civilization that is as ethically developed as ours is. There is no salvaging a book like this, and you can tell because even somebody smart like Bishop Barron, once they start off with the assumption that this is true, they try and find some way to make it make sense anyway, then there's only so much they can do. You can make up explanation, you can pull things out of thin air, you can reinterpret stuff, you can claim some things are metaphor and other things are literal, but eventually you just get tangled up in all of these elaborate ex post facto justifications for why this book is a complete mess and exactly full of exactly the type of stuff we would expect if it were not inspired by any god.
We read the whole Bible in the light of the crucified, nonviolent, compassionate, and forgiving Lamb of God. Read the Bible through that lens, you'll read it right.